Define oxygen dissociation curve. Can you suggest any reason for its sigmoid pattern? So students, let us learn about the oxygen dissociation curve and the pattern why it takes a sigmoid curve. The oxygen dissociation curve is a graph showing the percentage saturation of oxyhemoglobin at various partial pressure of oxygen. So students, here it is a graph. So this graph will have x-axis and y-axis. So let's call this as y and this as x-axis. On the y-axis we have partial pressure of oxygen represented in millimeter of mercury. So there is 0, 20 millimeter of mercury, that is partial pressure of oxygen, 40, 60, 80, 100, so on. And on the x-axis we have a percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. So 20% of hemoglobin gets saturated with oxygen, 40, 60, 80, 100. So this is represented on the x-axis. Now at 20 millimeter of mercury, so at this point here, so this triangle represents at 20 millimeter of mercury, around 30% of hemoglobin gets saturated with oxygen. And let us consider the next one, that is 60. At 60, so this is the common point where it meets. At 60, around 90% of hemoglobin gets saturated with oxygen. So if you observe this pattern, as the partial pressure of oxygen increases, the percentage of hemoglobin becoming saturated with oxygen also increases. So this curve is called as oxygen dissociation curve, and here the curve shows an equilibrium of oxyhemoglobin and the hemoglobin at various partial pressure. In the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is high. So always in the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen will be more, and this causes the oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin. So oxygen binds with hemoglobin and it forms oxyhemoglobin. But this is reverse in case when it reaches the tissue. So when the oxyhemoglobin reaches the tissue, in the tissue there is low concentration of oxygen. This low concentration of oxygen causes the oxyhemoglobin to dissociate. Oxygen and hemoglobin separates, releasing the oxygen, and this oxygen will be utilized by the tissue. So this condition will always be seen. In the lungs, always the partial pressure of oxygen will be more. In the tissue, always the concentration of oxygen will be less. So this condition enables oxygen to bind with hemoglobin in the lungs and to separate oxygen and hemoglobin in the tissue. The sigmoid shape of the dissociation curve. So this shape is called a sigmoid shape, and this is due to the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. So generally each hemoglobin can bind to 4 oxygen. So once the first oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, so this oxygen increases the affinity of hemoglobin to bind to the second oxygen, and so on. So that is why the sigmoid shape will take place. So students, here we learned about the oxygen dissociation curve and the reason for its sigmoidal pattern.